welcome everybody. Welcome to day 2 of the big 5G event. As we've heard on the first day, there's a lot of focus on 5G from an infrastructure perspective and from a service innovation perspective. So we thought today would be a great way to kick off the session would be to look at 5G and really look at it in the context of moving beyond simple infrastructure, but really focusing on some of the applications and the skills that are going to be really necessary to monetize 5G and to move into a digital lifestyle. So that's what we're going to be addressing or considering and discussing today on our panel today. So let me first start by introducing our panel members. So we have with us from Huawei joining us today, we have with us Paul Scanlon. Paul, maybe you can take a minute and introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your role at Huawei.
Thanks very much. So I'm the CTO of the Carrier Business Group, and I've been around 12 years in the company. My job really is to do mostly transformative things in the company, specifically focusing on, at the moment, use cases of 5G and trying to develop the industry in using 5G beyond things like our B2C, so predominantly in the vertical industries. And today I'll be talking a little bit about those.
Okay, perfect. And Mohammed, maybe you can introduce yourself.
Hello, everybody. Hi, Paul, James, and Well. My name is Mohammed, and I'm a member of Huawei Wireless Network and Cloud Core Marketing and Solution team. Basically, my responsibility is around demand generation and technical marketing, and globally, specifically focusing on 5G inclusivity and also universal connectivity for all. So pleasure to be here, and thanks for everybody for joining us today.
Great, thanks, Mohammed. And Will, from Moore Insights and Strategy, can you introduce yourself, please?
Sure. So, yeah, I'm a senior analyst. I manage our networking practice. I cover both enterprise and service provider, and I'm also a frequent contributor to Forbes and write quite a bit about 5G. So I'm excited to be here and looking forward to the discussion.
Okay, great. Okay, so let's jump into the discussion, or before we jump into discussion, let's have a little bit of background to sort of set the scene for some of the discussion we'll have in today's session. So let's start first by kind of focusing on initially looking at sort of the value of intelligence inclusion in 5G, looking at the value of being able to educate, collaborate, and share, and really focusing on some of the commercialization. So what we're going to do is we're going to first start with Mohammed. And Mohammed, you're going to first start talking about sort of the attributes of connectivity in a holistic fashion. So please go ahead.
All right, thanks a lot, Jim. I guess it's quite clear now that technology, ICT in general, are carrying the flag when it comes to recovery from the pandemic or even economy restoration in terms of jobs and also serving all of other industries. And it's clear also that 4G, 5G, AI, edge are at the center of the stage. So basically, today's topic is beyond the infrastructure. And I think I'm sorry, something got into my eye. And I think of course we need to think infrastructure is basically important, and I like ITU when they summarized the way for economy and countries to get its leadership globally. It's about 4 I's. It's about investment, infrastructure, innovation, and inclusivity. So I think today we're going to go beyond infrastructure, but still we need to talk about investment, innovation, and inclusivity as well. So I basically took the liberty of putting a term that's a wider term for digital inclusivity. We're all talking about digital inclusion. So I thought today to just throw a term there, which is basically intelligence inclusion. And what really motivated me to put that is that we always look at the connectivity, even when we define it by industry organization, we define it by either the coverage or how many smartphones or whether people are using it or not. But to me, I guess there is a wider meaning of connectivity, which should go beyond the infrastructure. So if you look at that slide, so I put really some attributes, and it's really open for everybody to put more attributes, if you will, so that we can all talk about full connectivity in a very holistic, inclusive fashion. So of course, the first one that comes to our mind is the availability, which is the infrastructure, the availability of infrastructure in all areas for all scenarios using all spectrum bands and all of those things, which I think is not the topic for today. The other point is accessibility. Accessibility in the past used to be more like smartphones, or just being or having a phone. I guess today accessibility should have a wider term when it comes to all kind of terminals. We're talking about CPE inside home. We're talking about industry modules. Even in the future, we're talking about drones. We're talking about a lot of other things that allow not only people, it also allow enterprises, people, businesses, in order to access the great things that 5G and ICT are providing to us. So that's the accessibility part. Affordability, affordability, affordability. Not just as the price of smartphone. Yesterday, 2 days ago, I got the news that Oppo, I believe, they have a 5G smartphone now about 999 RMB, which is basically less than $150. But affordability is beyond that. Affordability, when it comes to putting together a very a profitable business model, may be in order to use this technology for businesses. Affordability in also monthly service for broadband. So we can talk a lot about affordability and how the price for connectivity related to the income really makes sense. And there are a lot of studies on that nature. Literacy. Well, again, literacy in the past was like, am I able to use my PC? Am I able to access the internet? Am I able to use my smartphone? That's literacy. But even that has a wider term now when it comes to skills and talents. Even when it comes to knowledge, like for AI or cloud or all of those things, it's important. I believe we even need to talk about literacy and knowledge for other industry verticals. When it comes to mobile network operators, they need to understand what is it that they talk about and how they strike an agreement with other business in order to have that wider meaning. Quality in the past, voice, connectivity, handover, quality, speed. Now service quality is even having wider term when it comes to reliability, when it comes to security, when it comes to latency. So even service quality has wider meaning. When it comes to service value, is the service I'm providing to business and people, does it have certain value when it comes to profitability? Everything is about business, and I guess Paul now will talk to us about the importance of money. I know. So basically, service value. Like at the end of the day, you need to have profitable business model, not just I'm covering rural area and that's all. Intelligence. So basically, having AI in the middle. 5G by itself, it cannot be as a business by itself, solo in a business model. Every business model I've seen in all of the carriers and everybody, they have AI in it. And now you also need to talk about edge. Convenience. You have to talk about conveniency of the service for person, for enterprise. So all of those. So my view, just to summarize what I want is, it's all about the holistic fashion on how to look at the connectivity beyond the meaning of infrastructure. And Jim, if you please go to the next slide to summarize. And that's actually Huawei Vision, which we are bringing digital, we're bringing prosperity, we're bringing intelligence to everybody, every home, every organization, so that we can enable everything should be sensing, everything should be connected, and at the end of the day, all of those need to work in a very intelligent fashion. So those are my comments, and we can discuss more in the question part.
Great, thanks. Yeah, we'll do some of these in the discussion topics. So let's now turn the presentation over to you, Paul. You're going to talk a little bit more about monetization, I believe.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Mohammed. You're always right? Everything's about money, yeah? You know me too well. when I was looking at the topic, I thought beyond infrastructure and availability, skills, and things like that, and affordability, etc. It may be come back to what we were presenting. I think it was yesterday in the keynote, and I sort of finalized with this particular slide. So I thought I'd really have a look at the target is always okay. You've mentioned money, but what's the target? The target is how to transform the industries at the bottom. If we put aside the B2C business, yes, I'm just focusing and looking at the B2B business at the moment, sort of the transformative aspects of 5G. And I guess that the three areas that I want to focus on is first of all really is about education, because there is so much misinformation about 5G around the world, right? Everybody from security, saying because of 5G, security is a big problem, and even down to thinking that 5G will cure all. And as you've just said, Mohammed, 5G by itself is not. AI is a very significant component of that. But without connectivity, without everything and everybody being connected, and then pulling all this data up into some form of cloud with AI, and then analyzing the output from that, you're not really going to get any transformation or big transformative effects in industry. So the first concept really is about education. That's everybody understanding that it's a second part collaboration. A telecom provider building towers and selling SIMs, the concept of infrastructure plus SIM, that's not going to transform anything either. So what does a telecom operator do? It's really a platform for transformation. And they start by selling actually security. The most secure company are actually telecom companies. And, I haven't put anything in there relating to the pure connectivity bit. It's all really around computation and storage, etc., and information exchange together with security. But the area I wanted to focus on was really about collaboration. And, together with education, if governments don't understand that the right regulatory policy for industries, and I don't mean the telecom industries, I mean things like health, I mean like manufacturing. If you want to transform manufacturing industry, then a telecom operator needs to understand and be incentivized to provide the coverage, the connectivity of the robots within the factory. If you want to transform health industry, you need all the pharmacies, you need all the medical clinics, all the doctors, the hospitals connected. But today that's not the case, right? Same thing with transport. You want to improve the GDP by 2.5% by connecting all the traffic infrastructure. It's not going to happen if you're not building, sites along the roads, for example. So different government departments collectively need to understand what they have to do together. So what I've tried to paint the picture at the top is really to demonstrate that it's government plus technology service providers, vendors like Huawei selling, AI and devices, together with application developers and IoT and developers. That's what's really needed. So the concept, how to do this thing, which is where I've been trying to focus the last few years, is all about incubation and collaboration between all of these industry players. And I guess those three things are what really balances the concept of innovation against commercialization, because there needs to be a level of trust between all the players to understand that I'm not trying to compete against you, you're not trying to compete against me, I'm not trying to steal your R&D or trying to get an edge on you. But without everybody playing together, you're not going to transform everything. And that's the component that's missing today, which is called trust. I keep quoting that, Superman is great, but he can only be in one place at one time. He's got to do things serially, right? And, one company might be strong, but, joint ventures, multiple companies working together, focusing on a target. You want to fix COVID. One country can't do it by itself. One company can't do it by itself. You need collaboration. And the same thing with transforming any of the industries, whether it's agriculture or tourism or education or health. So that's really the area that I'd like to concentrate on beyond this thing called infrastructure. But without everything being connected and built, connected things and people, you don't have a platform to start this opportunity that 5G and all the things that Mohammed mentioned. Those sorts of things can't happen. That's the concept of the inclusion.
Okay, great. Okay, are you anything else you want to add to the slide, Paul?
No, that's it. I'm only going to talk about this. I'd like to hand over to Will, please.
Okay, great. Okay, Will, we'll turn it over to you to talk a little bit about the value of digital literacy and also some of the use cases.
Yeah, let's cycle through the key transitions there. And, Mohammed and Paul did a great job laying the context. And so when I thought about this subject, it harkened back to work that I'm doing. I'm actually writing my first book. and it'll be publishing sometime mid next year. And it's entitled The Human Network. And I'm going to travel to 3 different areas, around the world and look at the impact of connectivity, but more importantly, enhancing customer experience and use cases and how powerful that will be. And one of the interesting things, during my preliminary research is that, despite all of these advances that we have with software-defined tools, with virtualization, with open source, 5G and AI that Mohammed touched on, still nearly half the world's population remains unconnected. So that gets me thinking, I mean, what is driving that? And certainly, one factor is money, right? We were joking about that earlier. I mean, infrastructure is expensive to deploy. And in some of these underserved areas, whether it's rural America or whether it's a developing country like the African continent, there are challenges with physical topology and distance. There's lack of fiber, and there are also lower population densities that make it difficult for operators to amortize the billions in US, dollars and euros and RMB that's required to deploy this out. So, from my perspective, that's one of the challenges is the economic, but I think there's another, challenge in that there's this gap, and Mohammed touched on it with respect to digital literacy. I kind of think about, my father, who was a PhD in economics, a very smart man, but I was his IT support desk when he couldn't connect to his Wi-Fi router. So there has to be a focus on literacy, and then also I think in the past operators were very focused on access. And, there's that term, the dumb pipe. And I think there are still some people out there that don't perceive the value of 5G. Maybe they don't understand what lower latency and faster throughput will mean for them. So if we move to the next slide, I'd like to talk about some examples of what's really working well today. And so I looked at this from sort of 5 buckets. Number one, government subsidies and involvement. There's an obvious challenge in some of these underserved markets. And so it behooves governments to step in and implement programs. And one example in the US, we have a challenge with respect to having cellular connectivity in rural areas. And, what that could do, if we can get there, is it can improve agriculture technology, it can improve crop yields, and it betters mankind and society in general. So one example of government program here in the U.S. is the Rural Broadband USDA program, and it's aimed at earmarking actual hard dollars and incentives to operators to get fixed wireless access out to these areas that just simply don't have fiber, and provide the kind of the services on top of that. And there are a lot of efforts that are going on right now. I was recently educated on an effort in the U.S. called Trilogy, where a lot of smaller ISPs and operators that serve the rural part of the United States are putting a coalition together to really go try to figure this out. And also there needs to be some tribal knowledge, some understanding of what is available from a government, whether it's in the U.S. or it's in Asia or it's in Europe. So I think that's a great model that other countries should consider. Secondly, infrastructure provider-led programs. So, I talk about the economics and how it's difficult to get connectivity out to some of these outlying areas. Cisco has done a great job in my mind with their CDA program, Country Digital Acceleration Program, where they're actually going out and helping stand up infrastructure to get some of these outlying areas connected, and it's transformative. There's one example of, I believe it was in India, where they were able to do this in a small town, actually get not only the school connected to further education efforts, but allow small merchants to be able to actually get on the internet and market their items and sell their items online. So that's a pretty huge investment on Cisco's part. Are they necessarily going to reap the benefits monetarily initially? maybe not, but they're really driving, a program that's going to deliver good. And certainly Huawei, has a similar program where they're very focused on that. But there's education that's required as well, right? We'll talk about literacy in a moment, but examples like the Huawei Cloud Academy. And so, these efforts that, from the infrastructure providers that can help sort of incubate and drive these use cases, in my mind, are really, really critical. Another avenue is you have the infrastructure side of things, but the operators are the ones that manage and deploy these networks with the gear that, like the Huawei's of the world deliver. And during COVID, I found it very impressive that Telefonica put together an online catalog of courses, and many of these were free. And it ran the gamut from basic coding to 5G 101. And so efforts like that are operator led to educate subscribers will improve and increase the perceived value of having the connectivity. The fourth bucket, from my perspective is, we are seeing, lower cost smartphones. I think Mohammed alluded to that. Companies like Qualcomm are creating chipsets that kind of span the range of, high, mid, and low, and certainly Huawei has silicon capabilities there as well. But I think for a lot of people, the flip phone is good enough for them for basic communication. And I think in many parts of the world, and maybe Paul can comment on this, and Mohammed, people use their smartphones to transact banking, right? And all they need is just a flip phone. So how do infrastructure providers and operators promote the value of actually having a smartphone? Well, I think COVID is an excellent opportunity where people are concerned about their health, right? So it's health monitoring, it's temperature, it's heart rate, it's that sort of thing. But it's also things like ensuring social distancing and contact tracing. And so I think COVID, however unfortunate and tragic that it's been in changing all of our lives, there's a silver lining in that infrastructure providers and operators can use it as a tool to demonstrate the value of the smartphone. And then finally, I think, location-based services are a huge consideration. And, this basically moves the discussion from just access. So, who cares? Most people probably don't know what a sub 5 millisecond latency means to them. I mean, we all know on this panel because we're technology experts, but it's sort of the so what. So if you can blend the technology with very impactful services that we use every day, such as navigation, search, enhancing the brick and mortar retail experience, infotainment, and mixed reality, and mixed reality applications not only for consumer, but also for enterprise. If you think about using AR, VR in a field service application where you can send someone out with limited training, have a device like a foldable device like the Huawei Mate X, and be able to communicate back with high resolution video in real time to diagnose an issue and help fix it with someone in a support center that could be, hundreds, if not thousands of miles away. I mean, that's really powerful. And so, from my perspective, these are sort of 5 buckets that I think, and we've got great examples around the world that I've pointed to. But I think if we can scale this globally, and Paul made a very important point, this is about collaboration. None of this really comes together from my perspective unless we have the right level of collaboration between all of these parties. So with that, Jim, I'll hand it back to you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Will. So we're going to now kind of take some of these concepts and we're going to talk about them in kind of more detail, have a little bit more open discussion. So thanks for those slides from you three of you for helping us sort of set the stage. So let's kind of move into some discussion topics. And we want to start first with collaboration. And as you just talked about, Will, collaboration is key, and Paul talked about it. But I mean, so collaboration is obviously becoming an important part of a telco's value proposition. But it's obviously, as any sort of transformation, there are some, I guess, best practices or concepts or strategies that have to be implemented. So obviously, I guess my question would be, what are sort of some of the steps in kind of moving this forward? So for any sort of service provider, telecom operator that wants to adopt this model, what's kind of some of the I guess, the requirements of the best practices that they can implement to sort of start the process. So maybe Paul, I'll start with you.
Yeah. Am I supposed to be in the bottom corner, or should I be in one of the quadrants?
You're in one of the quadrants.
All right. Okay. Yeah. I think I'd like to pick up from what Will was mentioning that, yeah, so the reason I mentioned about collaboration, maybe I'll pick up on one of your buckets there, Will, and blend it together with what Mohammed was mentioning. But I'll give you an example of a collaborative use case. So let's take it from the operator's perspective. Okay, operators really to invest in, maybe 5G in some countries, like developing countries. This is a real use case. I'd rather not mention that country at the moment. But so operators reluctant to invest in 5G. He can't see the business value. And one of the reasons he's reluctant is because spectrum costs a fortune. And we know that because the US has just auctioned a bit of spectrum, and you're going to auction some more, right, for a couple of billion here and a couple of billion there. Just remember, that's a couple of billion that doesn't sit in the operator's pocket to, okay, let's start with infrastructure deployment, which is the connectivity and beyond connectivity, which we're both talking about. So what we did was we proposed to the government, look, what's your target? And the government says, look, I need votes. Okay, why? Yes, we get it. That's their target. And the telecom operator wants EBITDA, right? He wants profit. It's clear. But the two are different. So what we said was, what's the target? Your target, Mr. Government, is healthcare and education, just the things that we were just starting with, right? So what we said was, why don't we provide a low-cost solution for rural areas that includes some handphones, inexpensive ones, as you suggested, Mohammed, maybe some e-education tools, big screens that sit in a school with cameras, all the integration in the back end, of course, because it won't work with just a screen and a camera, together with a kit of IoT-enabled 4/5G devices for measuring, temperature, body, pulse and oxygen content and things like this, heart diagnosis tools, etc. Yeah. So we put a whole package together like this. That's the rural connectivity. And then in exchange for an operator investing in this package to put in a rural area, the government reduces the cost of the spectrum. And then instead of charging all the money up front, the government spreads the cost, that balance, across 10 to 20 years. So what we have now is we're not selling infrastructure at all. In fact, we didn't even mention infrastructure. And we're not selling it or proposing the concept of reduction in spectrum fees to the regulator. We're talking to the government as a whole, because the government as a whole has the targets. The operator has a target. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to bring everybody together to understand that together we can achieve a target. Mr. Operator, you want profit. You won't build a rural site because there's no money in it, because people only spend a couple of dollars a month. You can't cover a cost of $10 or $20 or $100,000. Mr. Government, you need e-education, e-health, okay? Those things develop and stimulate the industry. That's how you stimulate the economy, which is your target. But by providing packages like this and thinking outside the box, that's what drove a combination of an operator to invest in a rural solution that was not called telecoms, right? It was called e-education, e-health. And that allowed the government to understand that if it changed policies, okay, to incentivize this. So I believe that this comes back down to, I think, Mohammed, you started the conversation with this concept of inclusion, affordability, right? You started with affordability. How do we do those sorts of things? Well, you have to understand who can afford it. The operator can't even afford to deploy. Even 4G, you mentioned half the world's not connected. Absolutely. Yeah. Do we want them to be connected with 2, 3, or 4G? In some countries, operators still think, I'm happy with 3G. 3G is good. What, milking the cow? 3G, 2G are not digitally transformative, and they consume resources. So we need to educate. That's why I keep coming back, Jim, to the question at the beginning, right? It's all about education. We've got to educate everybody in how to do it. Everybody knows what they want to do. How do we do it? What's the practical way? And that's why I liked what you mentioned before, which is about the collaboration. So, that's my 2 cents worth.
Okay. Will, what are your thoughts here?
Well, I touched on this, and I talked about consortia, and I talked about, governmental, sort of involvement. And I actually wrote an article, and it was part of a 6-part series from my firm on who was really leading in 5G. And I looked at countries, and I looked at where consortia was getting driven, because consortia and open source has the power to really harmonize things and be disruptive from a CapEx perspective, because these are not trivial investments that operators are making to build out these 5G networks. And so I guess one good example, I mean, one great example is the Linux Foundation networking organization and all the different working groups that are involved there. I know Huawei is involved in a lot of that, Paul. But also just looking at just in general, coalitions like what's going on with Open RAN right now, and it's sort of, and I've written an article on this as well, and I think the jury is still out. I think they're definitely positive, aspects from a CapEx perspective, and it allows you to really build out the radio access network much less expensively with virtualized hardware and software, but at the same time, there's complexity that comes along with that. But these are good discussions to be having. To Paul's point, to look at this from a different angle and to get really creative.
Okay, Mohammed, your thoughts here?
Of course, I'm in agreement of all of what has been said, Well and Paul. I believe this is fundamentally important. Inclusion in terms of literacy and collaboration is important. But I would like here to take very quickly another two angles. First of all, my views is that literacy and collaboration and all of those are not only important for digital inclusion when it comes to rural areas. I believe that even dense urban areas, even those people like organizations that they already have the connectivity and even 5G connectivity, but they are not educated enough to capitalize on the benefit of those. And I wanted to mention here many examples. The first one is the government. Actually, as a matter of fact, some government need to be educated when it comes to how to deal with ICT, how to leverage the weapons of ICT to elevate the country leadership and also to benefit people, society for their countries. I would like to mention two good examples. During the pandemic, countries like Hungary and South Africa and others, they expedited, licensing the spectrum because they believe that spectrum and 5G are fundamentally important. Other countries, they were distracted on things that doesn't have any basis. Fake stuff about 5G is not secure. It's an atomic bomb. We need to ban Huawei because, Huawei, it will destroy the world. These are people or government that need to understand that distraction is not going to help anyone. So this will come back and it will limit the definition of connectivity, which has a financial aspect to it, which is a competitiveness. When you do that, there will be no competitiveness, price will be high, and if the price will be high, those unfortunate communities that are living in the rural areas, they need connectivity, they will not find it. And for example, in the US, instead of subsidizing those areas, well, the government decided to spend $1 billion just to replace Huawei, for example. So I am not trying to bring another topic, but what I'm trying to say, holistic full connectivity has a lot of things. Collaboration need to be orchestrated by the government in order to overlook all of those things to elevate how the country, the people, organization will benefit from everything from 5G and AI. That's all.
Okay, so let's continue on a bit here, Mohammed. So I want to kind of go back to kind of your definition of, you talked about holistic inclusive connectivity. How would you define that? What are some of the principles associated with that? If we think about it as sort of a global, on a generic level, how would you define that in terms of, you had kind of a list of some of the things in terms of availability. What are some of the top, I guess, features that are going to really, I guess, define inclusion and digital connectivity in your mind?
Well, I guess my point is people used to define it as only percentage of connected people. That's all. For example, Will mentioned a very good example, which is half of the world is unconnected. But I'm trying to bring another definition even beyond that. If you put the intelligence inclusion, the other things that I put there, which is literacy for people, for government, for organization, for affordability, for phones, for programs, for spectrum. Paul talked about how government need to talk about spectrum and ICT and all of that. If you do that, trust me, maybe this 50% people that unconnected will go down to 25%. If you define this really the connectivity that we all looking forward to, no matter whether it's a good network, accessible from affordable terminals, intelligence, how things are used and all of those. So that's the whole idea. And if we have, I don't think we have time, we can go over many examples on each one of those attributes.
Okay, Will, what are your thoughts here?
I mean, when I think about it, just sort of in the kind of the vein that I shared earlier, I judge the success of connectivity in raising economic prosperity for these underserved areas and improving GDP in developing countries. And so, you know, from my perspective, that's a benchmark. I gave the example of that small village in India when, you know, connectivity was brought in, and it lifted not only the educational opportunities for a girls' school, but it created economic opportunity for those that would have had no way of promoting or marketing their goods that they're manufacturing or that they're producing. So what's really exciting for me is, like, you know, because we all three, you know, and you as well, Jim, you know, we cover 5G and the technology, and there's sort of a whitewashing, I think, that goes on. And, you know, people are like, okay, 5G, you know, we're at the apex of the hype cycle, AI, you know, machine learning. What does that all really mean? You know, from my perspective, and Paul touched on this, it's like, you know, 3G and 2G, 3G and 4G are not going to move the needle. One of the most disruptive use cases that came with 4G LTE was ride sharing, right? And it disrupted an industry that needed to be disrupted on a global scale. And it's created additional value. It's created, you know, job opportunities for those that choose to drive. It's created a more valuable and convenient and a more highly perceived service for those of us that use it. And I'm sure everyone on this panel has done a few ride sharing sessions. What excites me is that when we do get to a ubiquitous deployment of 5G with AI and with machine learning, with the intelligence that brings, what earth-shattering, you know, use cases are just around the corner. And again, to get back to it, the lens that I view this with is that connectivity, intelligent connectivity, has the power to lift social inclusion and personal economic benefit.
Okay, Paul, before I bring you in here, I just want to run a theory by this panel. So one of the things, and I do been covering 5G for a couple of years, one of the things that I think is radically different about 5G is the core network's actually architecture. So basically we're moving towards a service-based architecture where we're now focusing on exposing APIs. So my theory in all of this is that in the 3G world, 3G in a lot of ways was all about kind of bridging the TDM of the 2G world and the IP world of 4G. It was transitional. 4G was to me kind of a pure IP build network, but it was still architecturally, it still had some of the artifacts of a traditional network. And then we virtualized it to kind of move it to the cloud, which was a major step forward in terms of security, but also in terms of scale. But 5G, with the 5G core, the service-based architecture, we have this network exposure function, these APIs, third-party APIs. I believe that over time, it's going to take some time for the outside of the industry, the average user to understand this. But I think the average user is going to start to understand that in a 5G world, services can be turned up faster. They have more of a vision or more visibility into the APIs they're using. So I think that in fact is going to kind of help drive some of this digital inclusion or this digital promotion of value. So I think that's going to happen. Sort of, it takes some time. There's no sort of cycle for this, but the actual users, as they start to become comfortable with their smartphones, comfortable with, you know, self-provisioning services, that's all going to happen. And I think because we bring these tools out and the users adopt them, and obviously some of the demographic users, some adopt faster than others. But I think that's fundamentally one of the important things I don't think we talk about enough in 5G, and that it's by definition, it's a new architecture, but by definition, it's also transformation because it is the first really service-based architecture. And to me, that's a huge thing that I think we need to focus on. Paul or Mohammed, or would you agree with that?
So I'll pick up from that one there, Jim, because I think it follows on nicely from what Will was just saying in terms of some of the more unusual use cases. So I'll jump straight into an example of a use case. Yes, just now I think Mohammed, you were talking, and to me, you were breaking up. Your picture was pixelated, and I couldn't hear you, etc. And then you dropped off, Jim, and so did you, Will, and then suddenly the whole thing reconnected. Yep. So let's just think about that. Okay, in a 4G world, this is what happens. Okay. This is exactly what happens. In a 5G world, where we can, as you've mentioned from service-based architecture, let's have a think about the concepts of the slicing. And I'm not going to go too much into the slicing, but the reason this happened is because little Johnny next door is playing with his video game, right?
Right.
And the operator can't differentiate or provide the service quality or the service level agreement between the two, I won't call it industry sectors, but between the two different businesses, okay, in this particular case. So the first thing you have to understand is 5G handles video much better than 4G, first. Secondly, 5G has the ability to handle up and down link in a different way to 4G, okay?
Mhm.
With the service-based architecture, the concept of slicing, we can now separate services that are perhaps similar from other services which are dissimilar, but similar in their own grouping. So in this case, gaming could sit somewhere else, and I'll say critical services like emergency service could sit together, enterprise-based services as we're doing today. You wouldn't want to have remote surgeries, not that that's going to be the next topic, but you wouldn't want to, okay, remote cars and all those other sorts of things being affected by something else. So mass IoT solutions or critical IoT solutions, for example, being restricted at a resource level by non-essential services. So what you've brought up is sort of leaning towards one component of that. But again, all the discussions around slicing, we're not going to have infinite number of slices. You're not going to have your slice. I'm not going to have my slice. Okay, that's not going to happen, because the efficiencies that come from 5G are because of things like 100 megahertz of spectrum. And no matter how you split up things, you're going to ultimately start encroaching on a lot of those components when you start slicing up the network. Remember, operational efficiency, billing, as you mentioned, service provisioning. Some of the biggest headaches that operators have are operational and billing, okay? Service provisioning, including in that. So to say that all those sorts of things will happen naturally, it will take some time, yes. As applications become easier and more flexible, you'll move into that area. But I just wanted to give you another example of, I think, Mohammed, you were just saying, let's take another example. Do you know that if we can improve 1% of predictive maintenance in manufacturing, we save $150 billion US. Now, I'll tell you now, it's not going to happen. And it's not going to happen because nobody's building 5G networks inside the manufacturing plants. You'd like to have connected ambulances, right? This high throughput, low latency, so that we can save lives in ambulances, right? It's not going to happen. I bet wherever you guys live, you're in Florida, right, Will? And Mohammed, you're sitting over in Dallas. So what, do you think just traveling on the national highways, you get a dropped call? That's a 2G, isn't it? Right?
Right.
And you're expecting low latency, high throughput on a minor road around the corner from your home where your mother's having some challenges. It's not going to happen, right? So one of the reasons is, I mean, you've made it as literacy, but I'm talking about educating. If you want to achieve those targets, if you connect all the infrastructure, okay, we're coming back to infrastructure. I don't really mean to talk about that, but if you want to improve the GDP by 2.5%, you've got to connect everything, right?
Yeah.
Now, that's not going to happen if municipal council in A or operator in place B don't understand where the ultimate game is. And so I want to come back down to the target.
Okay.
If we set the target, then we can all collaborate, understand what it takes to achieve the target. And I think, really, Mohammed, you're very passionate about it, right? I agree with you. I mean, yes, we're Huawei people. What's the point of spending $1 billion?
Love the technology.
What's the point of spending $1 billion to rip out Huawei in the rural areas? I was there in Denver. We have deployed 4G massive MIMO. It's 647 megabits per second to rural Americans.
Okay.
Tell me you get that in Florida Keith, or you get that in New York.
Okay, so let's change the narrative a bit. Let's kind of, we have a couple minutes to summarize here before we get to the Q&A from the audience. So basically, this I guess promoting. You want to be able to promote this value proposition. You talked about the 5 buckets. What are you, in your view? What are some of the steps that service providers, their telecom operators, need to take to kind of promote this view of digital literacy and promote the value of these different opportunities?
Well, I think it's a multi-pronged approach. I mean, number one, there has to be education, and I think Paul touched on this. I think again, we're at the hype of the 5G cycle, and what does it really mean? And we were just talking. You mentioned the service-based architecture, and and what that really means, and with network slicing. And I think there's sort of two sides of the coin here. Number one, the service-based architecture and the idea of network slicing is going to allow operators additional opportunities to improve ARPU and create new services, like for consumers, mobile low latency gaming. So if you're a Pokemon Go fan, I might be willing to spend an extra $5 a month to have that guaranteed low latency for that particular gaming application. If you're an enterprise, there are other things that are very beneficial to have, either depending on your use case, whether it's throughput intensive or latency intensive. So so at the bottom, kind of at the end of the kind of the road there, if operators can leverage this technology and create incremental services and profitability, that in turn, some of that profitability can be taken back and put into education, like the Telefonica example I mentioned, but also just in general to educate people on the true benefits of 5G beyond access.
Okay, good point. Okay, we're going to wrap it up there now.
I wanted to just to comment just a half a minute, because I actually love your question about the carriers, because mobile network operators now are considered not only just a carrier or a business, they are national growth accelerator. Sure. So basically, they need to follow, I believe, all of the 4 pillars to continue their role as a national growth accelerator. Technology, adoption of transformative technologies. Number 2, business, they will have to adopt the different business models. Number 3, operation, they will need to enhance productivity, automation of their network. Last but not least, organizational upskill for the new transformative technology. Those 4 are fundamentally important for the operators to keep their seat in the middle of the stage.
Okay. Paul, do you want to add anything here quickly?
No? I'm fine, thank you.
Okay, well, listen, great. Excellent discussion, and thanks for the presentation. So now we're going to now move to the audience. The next part of the presentation will be an audience Q&A. So let's get to the questions. Okay, so let's now move into the Q&A, as I said. So we've had a really interesting discussion on some of the discussion topics around AI and some of the fundamentals and the requirement for digital literacy and inclusion. So let's take some time to kind of maybe dive in a little bit more, and we'll wait for some questions from the audience as well. But Will, I wanted to start with you. You had an interesting discussion about operator-led skills training, and I think in a lot of respects, it's got nothing to do with COVID-19. It's just the way the world is moving to kind of a fast-paced training environment. And I'm wondering, there's obviously a lot of interest in this because of 5G and the connectivity, but also because in things like skills training, you need a lot of digital applications as well to kind of, be able to help the students learn. So it's far beyond just simple connectivity. But I'm just wondering for you, if you think that there's sort of a logical number of events or next steps that are going to kind of drive this kind of push forward into sort of digital skill set training.
Yeah, no, great question, Jim. And, I spoke to Telefonica as well as a leader during COVID-19, but I think beyond that, it's just, the carriers need to do it. This is an opportunity for them to create stickiness with their subscribers and provide more value beyond just access, right? So, we've talked about 5G and how that's going to unlock, transformative use cases given the low latency and the fast throughput. Now, I do think there have been some operators around the world that have done an exceptional job of highlighting and showcasing the potential AT&T is one operator that comes to mind. Through their Foundry program and through their AT&T Labs program, they actually bring customers into proof of concept labs and demonstrate the capabilities and educate them on use cases and applications, right? So, I think a lot of companies, even, the very large ones, they need a trusted advisor. And, from my perspective, driving the literacy of and education, especially around 5G, is just going to create, higher degrees of loyalty to the operators. So I don't know if the other panelists have any additional input there, but that's sort of my perspective on it.
Paul, do you have any thoughts here?
Yeah, I was thinking actually, Will, what you were just saying reminded me of the, we always talk about AR and VR as great use cases, yes? But a lot of the people thinking about AR and VR, but particularly VR, is always thinking indoors, inside, doing games and entertainment and stuff. But I remember looking at some of the use cases, for example, in health and also in manufacturing, and the use of AR-based solutions is really helping to upskill people. And if you think about it, let's suppose you want to take a manufacturing plant, you want to move it or start up a new manufacturing plant in a developing country. Yeah, where do you get the skills from it? But if you've got AR or advanced, training programs like this, then you can build up the skills and the literacy capabilities in quite advanced areas. So, 5G has a lot to add in these areas.
I'll add too, Paul, that there's a use case that, I kind of call it extended subject matter expert. And to your point,
yes,
you can equip, like field service technicians with, either a foldable device or, with goggles. And you can have someone in a remote location helping to diagnose issues. And so you don't have to have a highly trained person in the field, and that reduces the OpEx associated with it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so there's actually about 4 related use cases around there. The one I found very interesting, though, was I never thought about, if you're going to, everybody wants to offshore manufacturing, yeah? So you think that's a great idea because the cost of the labor is cheaper, right? But so too is the competency of the labor. So how do you upskill that? Well, the concept was exactly what you were saying. Yes, you can use it for maintenance, but you can also use it for training, and you can also use it for training people in developing countries. So I found it an interesting use case for specifically health and manufacturing.
Yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about health. We're going to talk a little bit about manufacturing and transport coming up. But Mohammed, do you have anything to add to this one?
No, I think it's all has been said, but I would like to add here that sometimes 5G helps AI and AI helps 5G because, as Paul mentioned, maybe you need more like 5G connectivity in order to upscale the AI capability of consumers, if you will,
right.
Because of the training programs. But also here actually to mention things about how to monetize. I mean, when you talk about upskill organizational structure and how enhancing the capability of people, that will be translated and transformed to money because it's all going to help at the end. Let's say, for example, enterprise, and an enterprise now they know more about AI, they know more about this, then now they can utilize this for productivity, they can utilize this for intelligence when it comes to the stream. And so the operator as well, the more you in digital or intelligence or AI level of literacy, I think it's gonna help everybody. So it's a key attribute of the holistic connectivity if we are really looking for the connectivity that needs to be monetized the real way.
And let's talk a little bit about that, about AI. I mean, AI itself is not something I would say that's readily monetizable in terms of it's more of a capability in terms of that you kind of infuse in the network to deliver services. But Mohammed, do you think there's sort of kind of first steps or best practices for implementing AI so it can be monetized? Just tie it to use cases, or is it more simply a matter of kind of like you said, having this kind of holistic end-to-end strategy?
Yeah, from both aspects, I guess. Yeah, I guess AI will help. Number one, AI will help on reducing the cost. You're talking about AI, and that's by itself is really fundamental. Adjusting business economics of the and how we adjust the bottom line. And from the other side, AI also will help with the use cases when it comes to big data analytics and how to deal with data. And if you get the super connectivity, then you need AI to deal with this data. And that's what will help you out in kind of adopting different use cases. So we had actually yesterday or today, we had Huawei Connect event Shanghai, and Goping actually in our rotating chairman in his keynote, he talked about the importance between 5 domains that will bring prosperity to everyone. So you have the connectivity itself, you have the cloud, you have the compute power, you have the intelligence, which is AI, and you have the industry application. So those 5 domains, they are synergized and they are react with each other to bring prosperity and better business economics for everybody.
Okay. Perfect, thanks. So there's a question here from the audience too. I wanted to sort of investigate. We obviously talked about 5G as beyond applications and infrastructure. There's a question related to using things like satellites for rural areas. And I think, as we move forward, and maybe Will, you have some thoughts on this, 5G will be foundational in a number of different ways, but there will be other applications maybe that could be, complementary to it, like using satellite services. What do you kind of see that from a rural coverage perspective?
It's interesting, this whole low orbit satellite, I call it the space race, right? You had OneWeb that was going at it pretty hard. They hit, tough financial times being part of SoftBank, and, now Hughes is stepping in there. You've got SpaceX with Elon, trying to drive this as well. And certainly in the US, SpaceX is wanting to use that low orbit satellite, to provide coverage in rural. But I think let's not forget about fixed wireless access, right? So I think that's something that Verizon's been very aggressive in deploying in the US. In fact, with their 5G rollout, they started with FWA and now they've moved to mobile. But I think satellites, even low orbit, there's still some latency, challenges. And he's the CTO on the panel. He probably has, more technical insight than I do. But I think it's going to be a mix of, and you've got microwave for backhaul as well, right? So, Paul, any thought?
I think, Paul, you're on mute there.
Yeah, so you're right. Well, it's all about latency, and it's also all about OPEX, yes? So, yeah, you have some CapEx costs when you build a remote and rural area. But remember, maybe 5 years ago, I think, Mohammed, you can correct me, but I think 5 years ago, a typical base station, the cell tower and everything, the infrastructure was costing around $150,000 to $200,000. Today, you can put a 4G base station up, including solar panels, including battery rectifier, backhaul, everything, the mast, the plinth, the excavation, building, everything, 10K US, right? Anywhere in the world, 10K. So that's the CapEx component. But a satellite, you've always got to keep it in orbit, and therefore you're always going to have to run some operational components. So, fuel as an example. And the second one, you're quite right, Will, is about latency. Yeah, we're running, I think our latest, Mohammed, you're the product expert. What is it, 0.3 or 0.33 milliseconds of a base station? Yeah, you're quite right. We've got the backhaul. And the backhaul will depend, location to location, how far it is. But if the backhaul is engineered properly, with only a couple of, in remote areas, microwave hops, and you're not routing anything, so it's more like a switched microwave service, then the latency is going to be pretty good. But remember, the applications for latency are really machine related. Humans don't need 0.3 of a millisecond. So, robotic surgery, we're not going to have robotic surgery out in the bush. That's not going to be a requirement. You're not going to have autonomous vehicles out in the bush, out in the desert, the remote areas. Not really. We will need remote monitoring of patients and a number of other use cases. But so I think, satellite is complementary. There's no doubt about it. But again, the operational costs, I haven't seen the latest figures, but it is a couple of $1 million per launch to launch several satellites. you get a lot of rural coverage for a couple of $1 million these days.
Okay. We're going to have to wrap up in about a minute, but maybe, Paul, we'll wrap up with you. And just, you talked about how 5G is going to transform a number of different areas, manufacturing, healthcare,
Yes.
you're talking about. If you were to look out 2 or 3 years, what industry do you think it'll be? Manufacturing, transportation? What will be transformed the most? Is kind of, I guess, what's the low-hanging fruit here from a 5G transformational perspective in your view?
So, Jim, the key really is industries understanding their problems and what can 5G do to help it. Yeah. So if we surveyed, and we did, about a couple of hundred people from manufacturing industry, most of them said, I know what 5G is, or at least they think they know what it is, and I know what it's going to do to my business. When we went to, example, transport, logistics, I would say less understanding. Even healthcare, not so much understanding. But if you look at the size of the industries, manufacturing and healthcare are the two biggest, right? I mean, energy, yes, of course, but energy to a different extent. So, in energy, if we just looked at renewables, it's about 350 million tons with the next 5 to 10 years. But if you looked at, say, manufacturing's got the opportunity to improve the GDP by about 750 billion. That's about 2.5%. That's significant in every country in the world. We'd love to save lives. You want to save 1 billion lives, use 5G.
Okay, so we're going to wrap it up there. So we have some really interesting discussion. So I'd like to thank you, Mohammed, and Paul and Will, for providing the content for the breakfast and for the really interesting discussion as well. And I'd like to also thank the audience for attending our session today. And thanks for everybody for attending. Thanks.
Thanks, Jim.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jim.